In 1967, Mercury would introduce the Marquis as a two-door range topper. It was not offered in any other body styles. It was just a two-door hardtop coupe, and certainly was a beautiful vehicle. Also important to note, at this point, it was not known as the Grand Marquis. That would come later, and the Grand Marquis would actually become a trim package option, an upper-end trim package option, beginning with the 1974 model year, and it would eventually become the name of the full-size Panther-based vehicle after Ford introduced a Fox-bodied Marquis in the 1980s. But 1969 was really a pivotal year for the Marquis, and that is because it transitioned from being that two-door coupe in 1967, its inaugural year, and 1968, the year thereafter, into a full line of vehicles. You could get a Marquis coupe, you could get a Marquis four-door hardtop, you could get a Marquis four-door post sedan, or you could get a Marquis convertible. You could get any kind of Marquis that you wanted for the 1969 model year. Also, the design significantly changed for 1969, and as you're seeing here up front, would set a new styling direction for Mercury into the, let's say, 1978 model year. What do I mean by that? Well, this 1969 version was the first Marquis to have the hidden headlamps that you can see here, this very linear grille, making the front look extremely wide, and it got some of that Lincoln flair associated with it. Remember, this was the Lincoln Mercury division after all, and that's what that crest is in the middle of the front end of this car that is looking seemingly Cadillac-ish, but it was known as the Lincoln Mercury crest because this was Lincoln Mercury division. But this was also the time period during which Mercury was trying to move its cars generally more upscale, especially the range toppers like the Marquis that you see here, and have them almost infringe on Lincoln a little bit. It was hard for buyers to discern for a number of years, was Mercury supposed to be kind of a cheaper Lincoln or a dressed up Ford? And in these years, particularly if you got a Marquis or a Marquis Brougham, which was the range topping car at the time, you were getting really a baby Lincoln, a little bit smaller wheelbase and a little bit less base price. But a lot of the styling cues are very Lincoln-esque and draw their inspiration from the 1961 Continental. More specifically, that very flat-fendered look that you see here. The rear quarter on this car does have a little bit of a taper, but in later years, Fords would have basically flat quarters as well. But that kind of flat-fendered look where the fenders are pulled out away from the headlamps that are kind of recessed inboard of them was initiated with that 1961 Continental's seminal design. And so it made sense to have Mercury kind of copy that. Also, you'll notice this little shoulder or little trough in between the window glass and that bright molding. The trough, as well as the bright molding itself, were also features of that 1961 Continental. Also, the wheel arches that you see here on the side are similar to the Lincoln, but different in that the Lincoln, for a number of years, not just on the 61 Continental, but continuing on through the Mark III as an example, had a wheel arch where the leading edge was relatively small, and then it kind of flared outward and got larger as the wheel arch went rearward. Here, these are just symmetrical wheel arches. But you also notice that this car has a number of features that make it very Ford and Lincoln-like versus, let's say, a Cadillac. One is, as an example, as I mentioned, those fenders that are flat and pulled forward. The second is that trough in between the window glass and the door. The third is, compared to Cadillacs at least, the lack of a skirted rear wheel. That 61 Continental that I mentioned also didn't have a fender skirt, whereas the 61 Cadillac did. And during this time period, fender skirts were just something that were not part of the Lincoln and consequently Mercury DNA, but they certainly were a part of the Cadillac DNA. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, later on, Lincoln would go to the fender skirt on the side in kind of a capitulation to Cadillac. And maybe in some ways, the Lincoln Mercury crest was also a capitulation to Cadillac. But Lincoln's always had their look. And that 61 Continental, you really can't describe how much that influenced Lincoln design for many years, all the way through, I would say, until the boxy town car was sunset after the 1989 model year. Now, this 69 Marquis is finished in a beautiful color called Dark Ivy, and it's like a greenish graphite color. I think it's absolutely stunning. This is a four-door sedan. Clearly has the pillar. This is not a hardtop, but it's just a stunning design, even for a four-door car Very masculine-looking vehicle, very authoritative-looking vehicle. And it's funny to me how they kind of pay homage to some other brands. As I mentioned, the front end of this Mercury is very Lincoln-esque in terms of that center form that has a very pronounced raised section to it, and the hood and the header panel. But this was the time where a lot of auto companies were going to the loop bumper front end. Think, for example, like the 1969 Chevrolet. Of course, you had other Chryslers that had it and went on to have the loop bumper for many years. This is kind of like a half loop bumper, if you will. You've got clearly a bumper that has a loop form, but it doesn't encompass the entire front end. In fact, that bumper bisects the grille, something that Chevrolet actually would copy and have on a number of their vehicles, including the 1972 Caprice and Impala. As we rotate around to the rear of this Marquis, you have also something that was really a Ford hallmark during this time and a Mercury hallmark, and that's that rising belt line that you see there on the rear door. And the interesting thing is you have the rising belt line. At the same time, you have this pretty chunky C-pillar, and you have a wheel arch that is lower in the back than the front. And this gives that entire area around that C-pillar almost this look of, let's say, power and authoritativeness, for lack of a better term. The body is getting taller in terms of the overall distance between the wheel arch and the top of the quarter. And that is kind of a very Ford Mercury-esque trait. Didn't matter if you looked at the coupes of this era or the four-doors like this car. It was just kind of the Ford style. And notice how relatively small the glass area is on this car. It's kind of a squinty greenhouse overall, a bit sinister looking, although the dark ivy color perhaps even helps that sinister look. If this car were in black, I think it would look even more like you were doing something, or you were, let's just say, a person of immense power, even more so than the person who ordered this car in this dark ivy color. Now, as we transition to the rear of this Marquis, there was a very different styling philosophy for the 1969 Marquis versus the 1967 and 1968 models. More specifically, those 67 and 68 models had vertical tail lamps and had some vertical forms to them in the quarters. Here you have a little bit of, let's say, a vertical accent that is further accentuated, for lack of a better term, by that peak, that bright work molding there at the peak of the quarter. But the theme here is clearly horizontal with the wall-to-wall tail lamp, something that would continue on Mercury's through the 1971 model year before it would be changed in 1972. And this entire rear end, I would say, is designed to accentuate the width of the vehicle visually. Not only do you have that tail lamp, you have, notice, kind of like a mini loop bumper. It's a fake loop bumper, but similar to the front, you have the bumper itself, and then you have this molding that completes the loop over top of it. So the loop theme recurs, but you don't have any creases, hard creases on this deck lid or the rear quarters at all. In fact, look at how gently sloping the deck lid is as it makes an almost 90-degree turn down toward the tail lamp. The lack of the creases in the middle of this, and also having the quarter panels be the peak and then the valley in the middle, which is effectively the deck lid, further lends to this look of width for the vehicle. Of course, you have the Lincoln Mercury crest that is covering the trunk lock cover as well, and the Marquis emblem. And no, a Desaad option was not available. Let's turn now to the interior, because as beautiful as the exterior is, Mercury really went over the top on the interiors of these cars as well. 1969, you got a completely new instrument panel. Gone was the Cyclops-style speedometer of the 68s and the driver's side only crash pad, or at least the pulled forward crash pad. Here for 1969, you have a completely symmetric crash pad across the driver and the passenger compartment. You have a little bit of the theme that would migrate into the 1970 Continental as well from an interior perspective, kind of that racetrack theme or inverted U theme. It's interesting that Ford would come out with that first on the Mercury and then bring it to the Lincoln as opposed to the inverse. You generally want themes to trickle down in terms of the price class as opposed to trickling up. But I guess it was different enough on the Lincoln that maybe people didn't notice it. Although, if you look at them side by side, it's quite similar. In fact, some of the hardware, like the vents, were even similar. And you do have the two-spoke wheel with the horn ring still, with the wood trim. This car does have the tilt wheel, and it's got quite a few options except power windows. It does have air conditioning, hence the vents in the dashboard there. But overall, I think the inside of this car being the same color as the exterior just lends it, let's say, a further degree of refinement. And notice the door panels, this kind of crisscross diamond pattern. That would also be seen on the 1969 Lincoln Mark III interior for 1 year on that interior. So a lot of idea sharing between Lincoln and Mercury during this time. As we transition to the seating, you also have very Lincoln-esque seating with that diamond pattern again, similar to the Mark III. This car does have the twin comfort lounge seats with the individual armrests. Notice the door panel and the steering wheel and the IP have this faux burl wood grain. By the way, the Lincoln would also have faux wood grain for 1969 in the Mark III before it became real wood in the 1970 and 71 model years, and then it would revert back to fake wood when the Mark IV would come out. But overall, very comfortable seating, great quality on the interiors. These cars were built very well. Great fit and finish for the period. I would say better than General Motors or Chrysler by a long shot, and Ford would continue that into the mid-1970s. But the interiors and the materials they used here, of course, also were top-notch. And this is the top-of-the-line Brougham. Now, as we transition under hood, we have the inaugural year in the Marquis for the Ford 385 Series V8, this 429 cubic inch V8. Of course, there would also be a 460, but that would be a Lincoln exclusive until partway through the 1972 model year when you could get the 460 on other vehicles like the Mercury Marquis. Here, interestingly, there really was only one option when it came to the engine, and that was that the standard engine, as you can see from the air cleaner, was a 429 2V or 2 Venturi. That means this 429 was topped with a 2-barrel carburetor. That was the standard engine, made 320 gross horsepower. The optional engine was a 429 4V or 4 Venturi 4-barrel carburetor that made 360 horsepower. Now, you may be saying a 2-barrel carburetor atop a 429 cubic inch engine. What the heck is going on? That makes no sense. And I have to say on the surface, I kind of agree with you, but I own a 71 Marquis with a 429 2 Venturi carburetor, and you know what? I love it. Anybody who's driven the Fords of this era, the 2-barrel carburetors feel snappier than the 4-barrel carburetors at part throttle. Of course, when you floor it, they don't have the CFM capacity of the 4 barrels, and they can get a little wheezy at the upper RPM range. But you know what? Driving around town and even passing around town, heck, even passing at 60 or 70 miles an hour, they have plenty of power. 2-barrel carburetors weren't always a bad thing. In fact, they were quite good for reliability, and especially in this era when Ford's Autolite 4300 carburetor was being used when you checked off the 4 Venturi box. I probably would have opted for the smoothness and the reliability of the 2-barrel. The Autolite 2100 2-barrel carburetor that came on these standard, excellent carburetor, like bulletproof carburetor. It just works and works. You can even run it and run the car with the top of the carburetor off to see if everything is working, like the float and the needle in the seat. You definitely can't do that with their 4 Venturi carburetor, in part because the float is attached to the underside of the air horn, top portion of the carburetor. So it sounds weird, but let me tell you, it actually works really, really well in practice. And these engines, the FE V8s, like the 390s and the 428s that preceded the 429s you see here, are very smooth engines. The 429s during this era, I think, are even smoother and quieter, especially if you have one that came like that from the factory. You'll really enjoy it if you find one of these cars. This car I actually almost bought, but I passed on it because I thought it was a little bit pricey. I think at the time, this was 5 years ago, the seller wanted something like $17,000 or $18,000, which if this had been a coupe, I would have paid. Maybe I would have stepped up to the plate if it were a 4-door hardtop, but being a 4-door post sedan, I thought, I'll pass. But it did have only, I think, 20,000 miles on it. And you can tell that from this engine compartment. It looks absolutely spotless. As we rotate to the side view of the engine bay here, we see that 2-piston York-Tecumseh style compressor that adorned many of the Ford vehicles and others of this era, but mostly Fords. Chrysler had its V-twin compressor. GM had its A6. This was okay. The refrigerant capacity wasn't that great, like 2.75 pounds, I want to say, whereas the GM systems on full-size cars were pumping around 4 to 4.5 pounds, just a lot more capacity. And that was one of the reasons why Ford would end up switching to the GM system beginning in 1972 on some Lincolns, because it cooled better than this setup. In a few more years after 1972, Mercury and Ford division would also get the GM Harrison style setup. In any case, this 69 Marquis is one of my favorites. This very Marquis is actually one of my favorites. Maybe I shouldn't have passed up on it because it's a gorgeous vehicle in beautiful condition and a great color. Oh well, but you can't buy them all. What do you think? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks for watching.